The rain had been coming down steady all morning, a cold February drizzle clinging to the ferry's windows as it churned its way across the Puget Sound. William Carter pressed his forehead to the glass and watched the water churn into gray foam. The world outside was all washed out blue and silver, a scene that could have been beautiful if he weren't so exhausted. His fingers curled around the hospital discharge bag on his lap, knuckles white, trying to ground himself in something real. He could still feel the echo of the surgeon's words in his ears, that low, careful voice explaining what to expect after open-heart surgery. No driving, no heavy lifting. Take your meds on time. Rest. As if any of that mattered when you didn't know if you had a home to go back to. He'd called Rachel that morning, his voice smaller than he wanted, half hoping she'd sound excited, relieved, even just distracted. Instead, she'd sounded irritated. Her voice clipped and cool, too busy to pick him up. Find a motel, Dad. I've got work. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds. He told himself she was just stressed, but even as he handed his hospital paperwork to the cab driver, he felt something unraveling inside him. A thread pulled loose from some old sweater that could never be knit back together. The cab ride from Seattle to Tacoma was a blur, but he remembered the silence, how the driver glanced at him in the rearview with a look that was both curious and pitying. William gave the address, Rachel's house, not his, not anymore, but it was the only place he knew. He stared out at passing strip malls and rain-spattered traffic, tracing old memories. Driving the same roads when Rachel was little, going to soccer games, grocery runs, even the day he helped her move into that house. His old Buick loaded with boxes, feeling proud and needed. The house on Willow Avenue was smaller than his old place in Portland, but had always been full of life. Hazel's ballet shoes in the hallway, Mason's Lego constructions everywhere. The kitchen table always a mess of homework and coffee mugs. When William had sold his house and moved up to Tacoma, it was supposed to be temporary, just until Rachel and Ethan got back on their feet. He'd given them nearly everything he had. The money from the Portland sale went straight to their down payment, and he took the guest room, happy just to be near the grandkids, to feel useful. But this time, as the cab pulled up, the driveway was crowded. Rachel's Subaru wasn't there, but Ethan's truck was parked behind an unfamiliar minivan. William's room faced the backyard. He noticed the curtains had been changed, the familiar blue ones he'd picked out with Hazel replaced by something floral, tacky and loud. He paid the driver, shuffling through his wallet for the last of his cash, and stepped out into the damp afternoon, his shoes squishing in the soft grass. He let himself in quietly, hoping the house would feel like home again. The hallway was silent, not the usual noise of children or the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. He walked down the hall and paused at his bedroom door. It was ajar, but as he nudged it open, he froze. His suitcase was on the bed, not packed with his things, but someone else's. A pair of men's boots too big to be Ethan's, and an open bag of prescription medication. On the dresser, the family photos he cherished. His wedding day with Linda, the Christmas at Cannon Beach, had all been turned face down. The room felt stripped of every trace of him, as if he'd never lived there at all. He stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, his breath coming shallow. The sounds of voices drifted from the kitchen, sharp and unfamiliar. He recognized Ethan's voice, low and anxious, and another voice, a woman's, with the hard, nasal edge of Mrs. Anderson, Ethan's mother. He stepped out, heading toward the kitchen, but stopped when he heard Rachel's laugh, too bright, too forced. The conversation died as he entered. Rachel turned to face him, arms crossed. She didn't smile. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Her tone was flat, almost businesslike. William opened his mouth, but the words caught. "They discharged me. The hospital. I'm supposed to rest. Take it easy." Ethan wouldn't meet his eyes, and Mrs. Anderson just stared, her lips pressed tight. Mr. Anderson stood at the sink, drinking coffee from William's old mug, the one Hazel had painted for him last Father's Day. Rachel's face barely moved. "We needed the room, Dad. Ethan's parents are staying with us a while." William stared, not understanding. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretches and snaps. Rachel's eyes flicked toward the sliding glass door. We set up the doghouse for you out back. It's weatherproof. There's a sleeping bag in there." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. William looked at her, at his own daughter, and for a second he almost laughed, certain she was joking. But there was no flicker of regret, no hint of apology, just the cold calculation of someone who's already decided your worth. He looked past her, through the glass, to the yard. The doghouse, barely bigger than a storage bin, sat on a patch of muddy grass, paint peeling. The kid's old soccer net collapsed beside it. For a moment he felt dizzy, the stitches in his chest tugging tight. He looked around the kitchen, the refrigerator still covered in Mason's drawings, the calendar with Hazel's recital circled in pink Sharpie. The life he had helped build now locked away from him. Ethan cleared his throat. "It's just for a little while, Bill. We're tight on space. Mr. Anderson's not feeling well." Mrs. Anderson shot her son a look. "You said this was taken care of." William stepped back, his heart pounding. "This is my house, too. I paid for this place." Rachel shrugged. "You helped, Dad, but it's time for you to move on. We need the space. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." The finality in her voice landed like a stone. The silence after was heavy. William's mind reeled, searching for some way to make sense of it. He thought of Linda, gone nearly 10 years now, and how she would have handled this, her kindness, her stubborn loyalty. He tried to speak but found he didn't trust his own voice. Instead, he turned away, his legs weak, the room blurring at the edges. He went back to what was left of his room, picking through drawers for what little remained. An old sweater, his medication, a few books. He heard Ethan's voice, muffled from the hallway. "We can help you find a place, Bill. There's a motel over on 6th. William ignored him. He moved slowly, folding his shirts the way Linda used to, gathering the few keepsakes the family hadn't managed to throw away or hide. He felt hollowed out, not just tired, but emptied of everything that had made this place home. In the living room, Mason's Lego spaceship still sat half-finished on the rug. Hazel's backpack, covered in stickers, leaned against the couch. The smallest things had always meant the most. He wanted to say goodbye, to explain, but he heard Rachel's voice in the kitchen, brisk and impatient, already making new plans. The weight of years pressed down on him. A lifetime of working, saving, helping, always putting family first, now reduced to a stranger in the only place he had left. He called a taxi, his hands trembling as he read out the address. The operator on the other end sounded young and bored, barely listening. William left a note for Hazel and Mason. Just a simple line. "Grandpa had to go away for a while, but I love you very much. Be good. And don't let anyone tell you you're not special." He set it by the Lego ship and walked out, closing the door as softly as he could, hoping the sound wouldn't wake the ghosts. The rain was heavier now, drumming on the roof of the cab as it pulled up. William slid into the back seat, feeling every bruise and ache, not just from the surgery but from something deeper. As the cab pulled away, he looked back at the house. Lights bright in the kitchen, shadows moving behind the blinds, the life he'd built still going on without him. The last thing he saw was Hazel's drawing taped to the window. A bright sun, 2 stick figures holding hands, and the words, "Best grandpa ever." He wondered how long it would take before they took that down, too. William Carter watched the city of Tacoma recede in the rain-warped glass of the taxi's window, a blur of streetlights and storefronts streaking by in the February twilight. His body felt weightless, drained from the hospital stay and the emotional sucker punch of Rachel's betrayal, but his mind buzzed with restless images. He pressed a trembling palm to his chest, feeling the gentle ache where the surgeon's hands had cracked him open and stitched him back together. It was nothing compared to the heaviness that settled now, as if every regret and sacrifice had suddenly pooled inside him, pressing against his ribs until it hurt to breathe. The cab's interior was a bubble of quiet, broken only by the hush of tires on wet asphalt and the distant echo of a country song on the radio. The driver, a woman about his daughter's age, seemed to sense his need for silence. Every so often, she would glance at him in the rearview mirror, but William kept his gaze fixed on the window, tracing shapes in the foggy glass as the city gave way to winding highway, then the familiar docks of the ferry terminal. He clutched his overnight bag like a life preserver. On the ferry to Bainbridge Island, William found a bench near the windows, watching the silver water churn beneath the hull. Somewhere behind him, teenagers laughed over lattes, a couple argued quietly about finances, and a little girl traced hearts in the condensation. He sat there, motionless, letting his mind drift back over the years. The days in Portland when he and Linda, young and full of hope, bought their first house, scraped together every dime, raised Rachel with bedtime stories and pancakes on Sundays. The way Linda's laughter always softened the hardest days. She'd been gone almost 10 years now, and William still caught himself reaching for her in the dark, expecting her to be beside him with a gentle joke to ease whatever pain the world threw at him. He wondered what she'd think of Rachel now, what she'd say if she saw her only child pointing toward a doghouse and telling her father that was where he belonged. He remembered the day Rachel called, desperate and in tears, asking him to move up to Tacoma to help after Ethan lost his job. He'd sold the Portland house, even took a loss on the old Buick, and emptied most of his savings to give Rachel and Ethan the down payment for the place on Willow Avenue. He hadn't hesitated. Family came first, always had, always would. The first months were good, even fun. Hazel and Mason followed him everywhere, sticky-fingered and loud, clamoring for stories and help with school projects. He mowed the lawn, fixed the leaky sink, patched the roof during the endless Washington drizzle. Felt like being useful again, like matching. But over the years, things had shifted, almost imperceptibly, until his space in the house grew smaller and smaller, his voice quieter, his presence more like a ghost than a father or grandfather. On the island, William made his way off the ferry and into another cab, giving the driver the address he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. 210 Wildwood Lane, Bainbridge Island. The words felt strange on his tongue. Linda's uncle, Curtis, had owned the place for as long as William could remember. They'd visited every summer with Rachel when she was a little girl. Picnics by the lake, fishing off the dock, Curtis's wild stories about the shipwreck on the far side of the water. After Linda passed, Curtis sent letters, kind, rambling updates and always an open invitation. William had tucked the last letter in a drawer, not ready to visit memories that cut too close. But when the cab pulled up to the overgrown gravel drive, William felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Relief, maybe, or hope. He stepped out into the misty dusk, rain tapping against the cab's roof. The manor was just as he remembered, big, weathered stone, wraparound porch, moss crawling up the steps, windows glowing faintly in the gathering dark. He stood there for a moment, listening to the wind in the cedars, and for the first time in weeks he felt truly alone, not abandoned. He fished out the old key Curtis had mailed him, a heavy brass thing with a blue ribbon. His hands shook as he slid it into the lock, half expecting the door to stick, but it swung open easily, and he stepped inside. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint scent of cedar and old paper. William clicked on the lights, illuminating a world preserved in amber. Curtis's library, books crowding the shelves, the worn leather armchair by the fireplace, the painting of the lake at sunset above the mantel. There were photos too, Curtis and Linda as kids, Curtis in his Navy uniform, William and Linda on their wedding day, young and fearless. He moved from room to room, fingers brushing dust from the backs of chairs, feeling the house come alive with every step. Upstairs, the master bedroom overlooked the lake, just as he remembered. The bed was made, fresh linens, a note in Curtis's careful handwriting. For William, when the world lets you down. There was another envelope beneath the note, marked, open when you're ready. He didn't open it yet. He was too tired, too hollow. He put his bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the silence settle over him like a heavy blanket. Outside, the last of the daylight faded. He listened to the wind rattle the old windows, to the distant rush of a train heading toward Seattle. For a moment, he let himself imagine Linda was in the kitchen making tea. Rachel and Ethan were calling, saying they were sorry, that it was all a misunderstanding. He blinked, and the house was empty again, just him and the ache in his chest. Sleep was restless, full of half-remembered dreams. When he woke, the sky was pale, and a chorus of birds was calling from the trees. William made coffee, black and strong, and wandered out onto the porch. The lake shimmered in the soft light, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no pressure to do anything, to fix anyone, to perform the part of the reliable father or the beloved grandfather. He simply existed, a man in a house full of history, allowed to be whoever he wanted, if only for a morning. He spent the next days exploring the property, discovering old paths and half-forgotten gardens, finding a shed full of rusty tools and a box of Linda's childhood things in the attic. He ate simple meals, wrote in a journal he hadn't opened in years, called no one. Sometimes he'd drive into town for groceries, where people smiled and nodded, sometimes stopping to ask if he was Curtis's nephew. There was an ease to these exchanges, a sense of belonging that was absent from the house in Tacoma. One evening, his neighbor from 2 doors down, Mrs. Wallace, stopped by with a basket of muffins and a friendly warning about deer eating the tulips. She chatted about the island's quirks, about Curtis's reputation as a storyteller and a soft touch, and William found himself relaxing in her company, grateful for the gentle normalcy. But under the surface, a tension grew. A nagging sense that his life as he'd known it was gone, that Rachel and Ethan would never call, that Hazel and Mason would forget him. He wondered, too, about the letter Curtis left, sitting on the nightstand, waiting to be opened. Every day, William caught himself reaching for his phone, expecting some apology or explanation, but there was only silence. He would go to the lake at dusk, watching the lights across the water flicker to life, feeling both the ache of loss and the fragile peace of starting over. The world had shifted beneath his feet, but somewhere inside him, a stubborn core of hope remained, as if the story wasn't quite finished, as if the next call could change everything. The morning he finally opened Curtis's letter, the rain had let up. Sunlight cut through the cedar branches and painted golden stripes across the floor of the library. William sat in the armchair with the envelope in his lap, feeling the subtle weight of a message waiting years to be heard. He unfolded the thick paper, bracing himself for the old ache of loss, but what poured out onto the page was not sorrow. It was an instruction, almost a warning. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness. This house is yours by right and by heart. Keep it close when the world turns cold. William stared at the handwriting for a long time, trying to picture the old man at the typewriter, pecking away with coffee-stained fingers, eyes bright behind those thick glasses. Curtis had always been honest to a fault. William felt something uncoil in his chest, a sliver of validation he didn't know he needed. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt both comforting and new. William busied himself with small repairs, clearing the gutters, oiling the porch swing, sorting through boxes in the attic. Every object, every book, every photograph seemed to echo back some lesson or story. He started to sense the manor was not just a house but a testament, built from decades of resilience and memory. Neighbors stopped by with soup and stories of Curtis's kindness, offering genuine welcome. The community on Bainbridge Island was nothing like the transactional, cold exchanges that had become the norm in Tacoma. There was a dignity in their small talk, a warmth in the way they remembered things that mattered: birthdays, anniversaries, tragedies. He took to walking the lake trail each evening. The water was glassy and still, the sky streaked pink as if painted in haste. Sometimes, as he watched the light change, he'd talk to Linda in his head, rehearsing all the things he'd failed to say when she was alive. Sometimes he rehearsed what he'd say to Rachel if she ever called, if there was ever a chance to make sense of what had happened. He doubted she would, but he kept the phone charged, just in case. In those walks, the pain of betrayal mixed with the guilt of old wounds. Had he leaned too hard on his daughter's life? Had he mistaken generosity for connection? Was it possible to give so much that you erased yourself entirely? Late one afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the trees, William paused on the dock. He heard the laughter of a family from across the water. Kids shouting, a dog barking, the kind of domestic noise that once filled his days. He closed his eyes and let the ache of longing settle. Then, for the first time, let it drift away, replaced by a curious sense of possibility. He realized then that the most dangerous thing about being alone wasn't the silence. It was the way old hopes could begin to root again, stubborn and wild. He felt the old need to be useful, to be loved, recede just enough for him to see what remained. A core of himself that was stronger than he'd thought. A week went by without incident. The rhythm of his days grew steady. Coffee in the kitchen, small tasks around the house, long letters to Hazel and Mason that he never sent. He kept a journal, trying to make sense of the past few years, filling the pages with what-ifs and regrets, but also small moments of gratitude. Sometimes he'd receive a call from Mrs. Wallace, who needed help fixing a porch step, or from Tom, the grocer, who insisted on sending him home with a bag of apples. These acts, so simple, seemed to stitch something back together inside him. Then, one gray morning, as the sky threatened another downpour, the phone rang. The screen flashed Rachel's name. William felt his breath catch, the past month collapsing into a single, trembling moment. He let it ring once, twice, then answered, bracing for anything. Rachel's voice was thin, brittle as glass, but unmistakably desperate. She stumbled through an explanation. The mortgage had lapsed, the house in Tacoma was being foreclosed. Ethan's parents had packed up and left without warning. They had nowhere else to go. She ended with a plea, heavy with shame. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call." William listened in silence. The letter from Curtis still on the table, the sun creeping across the floor. He felt no urge to rescue, only a clarity that surprised him. He asked about Hazel and Mason first. Rachel's voice caught. "They're scared," she whispered. "They don't understand why we can't go home." William heard the echo of his own fear, years of holding everything together so no one else had to worry. He closed his eyes and pictured his grandchildren, their faces bright and expectant, their innocence unbroken by the hard truths of adult failure. He told Rachel she and Ethan could not move in with him, that the manor was not a sanctuary for those who had thrown him away. The words tasted both foreign and right. But the children, he said softly, the children could come. He would welcome Hazel and Mason, give them the stability they needed while their parents tried to rebuild. Rachel was silent for a long time, then began to sob. William waited, the ache inside him sharp but necessary. He knew what it was to be desperate, to feel the cold snap of a door closing. But he also knew, at last, that forgiveness and self-preservation could exist side by side. That evening, William sat on the porch as dusk deepened over the lake. He thought of all the times he'd tried to hold a family together by force of will, by giving more than he had, by believing love was the same as sacrifice. He realized now it was not enough to be generous. You had to be just two. As the crickets began their nightly chorus, he felt a strange peace settle in his bones. He was not the man he'd been a month ago, not even the man who had sold his home for Rachel's dreams. He was someone new, someone shaped by the sharp edges of disappointment and the slow, surprising return of self-respect. He walked the manor at midnight, checking locks and windows, pausing in front of the photograph of Linda by the fireplace. He whispered good night, knowing she'd understand, knowing the story was changing, not ending. When he turned off the last light and climbed the stairs, he found Curtis's letter waiting for him, words lingering in his mind like a benediction. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness. This house is yours by right and by heart. He slipped the letter beneath his pillow and fell asleep to the sound of wind in the cedars, dreaming for the first time in years of a future that belonged to him alone. William waited on the wide porch of the old manor, his heart heavy but calm. The wind off the lake carried the voices of children somewhere distant, the occasional call of a gull. He watched the gravel drive, feeling the tension of old patterns unravel and tie themselves into new knots. The day Rachel called, her voice shaky and soft, had marked the beginning of this new test. She spoke with an exhaustion he recognized too well, the sort of weariness that only comes after too many sleepless nights. She said they had nowhere else. She said the kids were confused, frightened, and that she didn't know where to turn. He remembered listening, not interrupting, simply letting the tide of her words rush over him. The way she finally stopped, breathing shallow, as if waiting for a verdict. He had stared out the window at the lake, gray and endless, and told her what he'd decided. Hazel and Mason could come live with him right away. They needed safety and a sense of home, and he would give it to them. Rachel and Ethan, though, would need to prove they could build something on their own before he let them into his life again. No easy forgiveness. No return to old arrangements. He owed himself at least that much. Rachel wept, pleaded, then finally grew silent. He ended the call with a mix of relief and regret, feeling every year of his life pressed close. The day Hazel and Mason arrived, William met them at the front steps. Their faces were pale and drawn, but they tried to be brave, hugging him tight, holding onto his coat as though he might vanish if they let go. William welcomed them inside and showed them the rooms that would be theirs. Hazel in the sunny corner room overlooking the lake, Mason in the old study filled with books and the faded blue rug Linda had loved. He tried to give them the warmth of routine, making pancakes on Sundays, walking to the dock in the evenings, telling stories about Curtis and Linda that made the children smile, even if their laughter sometimes wavered. At first, there were nights when Mason would wake up crying, asking why they couldn't just go back home, why Mom and Dad had to leave. Hazel grew quiet, her old energy replaced by a careful politeness. William answered honestly when he could, never promising what he could not deliver. He said sometimes families make mistakes, sometimes grown-ups lose their way, but it didn't mean the kids had to carry that pain forever. As the weeks went by, he saw something shift in them. Hazel's grades at the small island school improved. Mason started bringing friends home after class, filling the empty house with the sound of play again. At the same time, William sensed a kind of hope returning in himself. He learned how to braid Hazel's hair and patch Mason's jeans, how to keep a household for children again. Each Saturday, Rachel and Ethan visited. They arrived in a battered sedan, clothes clean but cheap, their bodies thinner, hands rough from manual work. They'd found jobs at a diner and the local hardware store, and their stories of exhausting shifts and missed buses revealed just how little they'd understood about the world before. Rachel looked at her children with longing, sometimes with envy, always with apology in her eyes. Ethan kept his head down, his pride wounded but not gone. William set boundaries firmly. The visits lasted only a few hours. The parents would sit in the living room, watching their children play, then leave as dusk fell. The children would cling to them at first, but after a while, they let go more easily, turning back to William and the life they were building on the island. William kept himself from softening. He wanted to trust again, but something in him knew the danger of falling back into old habits. He saw how Rachel would sometimes look around the manor, her gaze lingering on the high ceilings and the old piano, her eyes calculating, as if the memory of past comfort was almost painful to her. She would ask if things could ever go back to the way they were. He'd shake his head gently, explaining that trust once broken wasn't so easily repaired, and that some wounds required more than just time to heal. He began to notice the children changing in ways he had not expected. Hazel started helping with chores unasked, taking pride in setting the table, folding laundry, caring for the house as if she, too, understood the gift of stability. Mason would sit beside William at night, listening to stories, but now he would ask questions sharp and curious about everything. Why the stars moved, how trees grew back after storms, why people sometimes hurt each other and say they love you. William did his best to answer, always honestly, never promising more than he could give. One afternoon, Mason brought home a permission slip for a field trip. He wanted William to sign it, not his mother. Hazel asked if William would come to her school play, and if she could invite her friends to visit. William realized, with a pang, that they were rooting themselves here, that this house and these routines were now their definition of home. The thought was both joyful and deeply sad. Through it all, William received letters from Rachel, notes that were short at first, but gradually lengthened. She wrote about missing the children, about her regrets, about her slow realization that she had taken his love for granted. She wrote about the small indignities of working for minimum wage, about the shame of being judged by strangers, about the gratitude she felt for the second chance he had given her children. She never asked directly for forgiveness, but the longing for it was in every line. One evening, after the children were in bed, William sat at the old desk in the study, reading the latest letter from Rachel. She wrote of how she was saving every penny, of Ethan's resolve to become someone Hazel and Mason could be proud of her own vow never to let pride or fear dictate her choices again. She ended with a simple sentence. I hope one day you'll see that we're trying, that we're learning. William sat there a long time, the house quiet around him, the lamp casting a pool of light over Curtis's old papers and Linda's keepsakes. He thought about the cycles of family, the ways love and pain twist around each other, sometimes pulling us apart, sometimes binding us together in ways we never expected. As spring arrived, William noticed the manor changing, too. The children helped him plant a garden, their laughter bright and infectious as they dug in the dirt, racing to see who could find the biggest worm. The house filled with music. Hazel at the piano, Mason on the porch humming to himself. William found himself laughing more, feeling lighter. He even joined the island's community board, surprising himself by volunteering for the annual summer picnic. Still, the tension remained. Each Saturday, Rachel and Ethan arrived, a little more worn, a little more humble. One day, Ethan asked if he could help repair the fence, and William agreed, watching as the man he once called son-in-law worked in silence, sweat streaking his brow. It was the first time they'd worked side by side since the move to Tacoma. When the job was done, Ethan thanked him, and William saw something new in the man's eyes, a mix of shame and determination. Late that night, William lay awake, listening to the wind in the trees. He thought about forgiveness and justice, about what it meant to set boundaries and still hope for healing. He wondered if Hazel and Mason would one day resent him for keeping their family apart, or if they would understand he was trying to protect them in the only way he knew. He thought about Curtis's letter, about Linda's kindness, about the long, tangled road that had brought them all to this place. He fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof, the manor breathing quietly around him, the future still uncertain, but no longer frightening. In the darkness, William dreamed of Linda's laughter and the children's bright voices echoing through the halls, a reminder that even in the hardest seasons, there is a kind of grace waiting for those who dare to choose it. The late spring air was thick with the smell of cut grass and rain-washed pine. William Carter found himself standing in the kitchen, watching Hazel and Mason bicker playfully over the last pancake. There were small fingerprints on the refrigerator, a battered lunchbox on the table, and for the first time in years, laughter rang through the old manor without any shadow behind it. William moved slowly, still careful of his stitches but no longer feeling frail. The children belonged here now, their shoes by the door, their drawings taped to the pantry, their voices echoing from the stairwell. This house, once silent with memory, pulsed with a new kind of life, yet peace rarely holds forever. Each weekend, when Rachel and Ethan's car crunched up the gravel drive, something in William tensed. Rachel stepped out of the car with her hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes, her clothes wrinkled and cheap. Ethan's face had changed, too, leaner, harder, humility stitched into every movement. They brought small gifts for the kids, store-brand cookies, hand-me-down soccer balls, but William saw what they truly wanted: forgiveness and a way back home. Hazel always ran to her mother, clinging tight, but the hugs grew shorter. Mason, once inseparable from his father, now pulled away first, eager to show William his latest Lego creation. William greeted Rachel and Ethan with measured politeness, offering coffee and space, never more. He never left them alone in the house. The boundaries were clear. It wasn't malice. It was protection of himself, of the children, of the new balance he'd struggled to build. Rachel noticed, and it stung, but she said nothing. After the first hour, conversation always drifted. Hazel and Mason would show off their rooms, their garden, their new friends. Rachel would ask questions, her voice thick with longing. She'd kneel in Hazel's room, tracing the books on the shelf, her hands trembling. William watched, feeling the ache of memory. Rachel at 5, hiding under the dining room table, clutching a favorite doll, begging him not to leave for work. There was love here, tangled with guilt and old wounds. He could not pretend otherwise. One afternoon, as rain battered the windows and the grown-ups sipped coffee in the kitchen, Rachel broke. Her voice trembled as she confessed how lost she felt, how she missed her children at night, how Ethan worked 12-hour shifts at the lumber yard to keep a roof over their heads. She begged William to let them all return, just for a little while, just until they could save enough to get by. Ethan's pride kept him silent, but the plea was written all over his face. William's chest tightened. He understood desperation, understood the urge to put family back together with sheer force of will. He remembered Linda's voice, calm and insistent. Boundaries matter, William, even when it hurts. He told Rachel the truth. This house was not a safety net for old patterns, not a place to run back to every time things got hard. He reminded her of the night she pointed to the doghouse, the humiliation of being cast aside. He spoke without anger, but without softness. If she and Ethan wanted to rebuild trust, it would not be easy. They would need to prove, not just promise, that they had changed. Rachel's face crumpled, and she wept openly, hands clenched in her lap. Hazel watched her mother with wide, silent eyes. Mason turned away, pretending not to notice. William's resolve wavered for a moment. The urge to pull everyone close, to pretend forgiveness was simple, nearly overwhelmed him. But he remembered the lesson Curtis's letter had pressed into him. Kindness without justice breeds only resentment. He stayed firm, and Rachel, broken but grateful, thanked him for his honesty. As summer stretched on, the children settled deeper into their new routines. Hazel joined the community soccer team, her quick feet and bright smile earning her the nickname Lightning. Mason became obsessed with building birdhouses, enlisting William's help and filling the porch with crooked creations. William watched them thrive, but also saw the confusion in their eyes every Saturday night, when their parents drove away, leaving them behind. He struggled, too, with his own doubts. Was he being too harsh? Was he punishing Rachel for old mistakes instead of helping her heal? Some nights he lay awake, listening to the rain, picturing Linda's gentle wisdom. He knew she would urge compassion, but he also knew she would want him to stand tall, to guard what dignity remained. He wrote in his journal, seeking answers, sifting through memory and hope and anger. Gradually, the visits changed. Ethan began offering to help around the house, fixing a broken gutter, splitting firewood, painting the porch railings. William let him, always watching, never trusting too quickly. Rachel found a second job at the local bakery. She arrived for visits with flour on her shirt, her hair smelling faintly of yeast and sugar. She apologized less and listened more. She read to Hazel at bedtime, helped Mason with his math. There were no promises now, only small acts of service, stitched day by day into something like atonement. One evening, after the children were asleep, William and Rachel stood on the porch watching the stars come out. Rachel spoke quietly about her failures, her pride, her terror at losing everything she loved. She said she was grateful for the boundaries he'd set, that she needed them, that maybe she'd needed them all her life. William said little, but inside, something began to soften. He still remembered the doghouse, the feeling of exile, but he could see how far she had come, how hard she was trying. He wondered if true forgiveness was less about forgetting and more about allowing the possibility of change. Hazel's school held a parents' night in early August. William attended, sitting between the other grandparents and younger parents, proud and awkward. When Hazel ran to him after her performance, beaming, William felt the last of his bitterness ebb. Mason won a science ribbon for his birdhouse designs. William and the children celebrated with ice cream, laughter echoing down the quiet streets of Bainbridge. Rachel and Ethan watched from a distance, their hunger for home plain on their faces. After the last visit before school began, Hazel hugged her mother tight and whispered, "I like living here, but I miss you at night." Mason, quieter, said nothing but squeezed Ethan's hand. William witnessed it all, the push and pull of love, the ache of separation, the possibility of healing. That night, he stood in the study, looking out over the moonlit garden. The house was quiet, safe, whole. He read through Linda's old letters, her wisdom flowing back to him. He knew he could not fix everything, could not erase the past, but he could offer a path forward. The choice now would belong to Rachel and Ethan. If they could rebuild their lives, earn trust not with words but with steady, honest work, then maybe someday the doors of the manor might open to them again. For now, though, he would hold the line, for the sake of the children, for the sake of his own soul. When dawn broke, William rose to the sound of Hazel and Mason's laughter in the kitchen. He felt something like peace, bittersweet and fragile, settle over the old house. Outside, the summer breeze swept through the pines, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings, and the long, slow work of mending a broken family. Autumn arrived on Bainbridge Island with the hush of golden leaves and the steady rhythm of rain against the manor's tall windows. William Carter stood in the study with a stack of envelopes, the final draft of his new will open before him, his pen resting just above his signature. The morning was quiet, Hazel and Mason still asleep, the house holding its breath as if the old walls themselves understood this was a moment of decision. William's reflection in the glass was softer now, the lines of worry eased by months of routine and recovery, but there was something steely in his gaze, a certainty that came only after you'd been broken and then forced yourself back together. He read the words on the page, the names, the instructions for the lawyer. The manor, the accounts, everything would go to Hazel and Mason unless Rachel and Ethan truly showed, a change deeper than apology. He put down the pen and walked to the kitchen, started the coffee, and listened to the slow creak of footsteps upstairs. Hazel stumbled in first, hair wild, rubbing her eyes, her voice still thick with dreams. Mason followed, quiet but grinning, clutching his favorite stuffed fox. Breakfast was a mess of spilled juice, burnt toast, and laughter. William watched them, his heart brimming with a love he thought he'd lost. As the children left for school, backpacks swinging, William stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, and wondered if the ache in his chest would ever completely leave him. The days shortened. William found himself journaling late at night, sifting through old photos, writing letters he never sent. He made peace with Linda's memory, finally letting himself mourn the parts of their life that had ended and honor the pieces he still carried. There were days when the old sadness came back, a pang at seeing Hazel braid her hair in the mirror, or the way Mason hummed when he concentrated. He realized he could miss Rachel terribly and still not let her back into his home. He could forgive in pieces, not all at once. Every Saturday, Rachel and Ethan returned. The routine held. A knock at the door, careful hugs, hours spent in the garden or at the kitchen table. The children's loyalty was fierce but gentle, their joy at seeing their parents always tinged with the knowledge that this reunion would end at sundown. Ethan brought tools, fixing a loose board on the back steps, patching a window. Rachel baked bread, kneaded dough with flour-dusted hands, her gaze always drifting to the shelves where William kept the family's photographs. Each visit ended with a quiet, searching look, a question neither dared to voice. "Are we enough now? Can you ever trust us again?" One cold afternoon, after the first frost had etched its signature on the grass, William received a call from the school. Hazel had gotten into a fight, defending Mason from a bully who mocked him for living with an old man. William left work on the house and drove straight to the school, his pulse pounding with old dread. In the principal's office, Hazel sat upright and defiant, refusing to apologize for standing by her brother. William listened, heart aching, as she said, "We live with Grandpa because he loves us, not because we have to." On the ride home, Hazel leaned her head against the window and asked if families could ever be fixed. William squeezed her hand, the words slow but honest. "Sometimes they break and you build something new. Sometimes you just have to keep loving, even if you can't go back." That night, after the kids were asleep, William sat on the porch with Rachel. The rain was soft, the air thick with the scent of wet cedar and earth. Rachel talked about her job at the bakery, how she'd gotten a promotion, how Ethan was picking up shifts at the dock. She said she understood now why William had done what he did, why boundaries mattered. She said she was proud of Hazel and Mason, proud of him, too, and she thanked him for protecting their hearts when she couldn't. William listened, searching for the old patterns, for signs of the entitlement that had driven them apart. But Rachel was different. Humility had become part of her posture, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. As weeks passed, small gestures stacked up. Ethan helped Mason with a science project, teaching him how to use a level and a hammer. Rachel attended every school play, every conference, never missing a moment. They saved money, found a small apartment in town, and filled it with thrift store furniture, hope, and discipline. When the first snow came, William stood in the yard and watched Hazel and Mason build a crooked snowman. Rachel arrived with mittens and cocoa, and together they all laughed, the sound rising into the gray sky, carrying the memory of old wounds but also the promise of something unbroken. William met with his lawyer and updated the will. He included a letter, in his own hand, explaining to Hazel and Mason the choices he'd made, the mistakes, the love beneath the hard decisions. He wrote to Rachel and Ethan, too, saying forgiveness would be a lifelong task for all of them, but that he believed in the people they'd become. One night, Mason crawled into William's bed during a storm. The boy whispered if he would have to leave, now that Mom and Dad had a new place. William wrapped an arm around him and said nothing was decided, but that families find their own shape, sometimes over and over. Mason slept peacefully, trusting that promise. William realized that love, in the end, is less about holding on and more about letting go when the time is right. The manor filled with visitors that Christmas. Rachel and Ethan arrived early, bearing gifts, nothing fancy, but chosen with care. Hazel made ornaments, Mason played piano, Ethan roasted a turkey with William, both men working in silence that was no longer tense but companionable. Rachel read Linda's old stories by the fire, her voice catching only once. At midnight, William stood by the window, looking out at the dark, the snow falling softly. He felt the ache of everything he'd lost, but also the fierce gratitude for what remained. In the new year, Rachel and Ethan invited William to dinner in their apartment, a modest meal that tasted of hope and second chances. The children laughed and told stories, proud of their parents, proud of themselves. William watched it all and knew that, despite the pain and the mess, something had been rebuilt. Not the family they once had, but something honest and sturdy. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, Hazel asked if they could stay at the manor forever. William smiled and said nothing lasts forever, but good things come back around if you work for them. Later, alone in his study, he reread Curtis's letter. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness, but real kindness, William realized, is strong enough to say no, strong enough to forgive, and sometimes strong enough to let go. As spring arrived, William planted a new tree in the garden with Hazel and Mason. Rachel and Ethan watched, their arms around each other, their faces full of something like peace. The years ahead would bring new troubles, new joys, but the foundation had changed. The past could not be erased, but it no longer held all the power. That night, William closed the house for the evening, listening to the children's laughter drift up the stairs, the sound of Rachel and Ethan cleaning up in the kitchen, the hush of the world settling into a softer kind of silence. He sat in Linda's old chair, the weight of old pain finally eased, and let himself believe, for the first time in a very long time, that he had done something right. The door stood open, the light was on, and love, battered but unbroken, waited for whoever was brave enough to come home.